way, it's more of a self-care presentation than anything. Now, what does that mean? It's a self-care presentation because I'm going to talk about, and not the classic self-care, and it's something that I will unpack. Kind of the classic self-care conversation is around take long walks and warm baths, and it's all about relaxation. I'm going to kind of turn that around a little bit and talk about a more comprehensive understanding about what self-care is and how we can better understand it and better optimize our own functioning. Now, before we go too far into that, though, I want to make sure you understand I'm going to be talking about self-care, but I'm not telling you that I'm perfect in regard to my abilities with self-care, because my disclaimer for any self-care presentation is that I'm a profoundly flawed person that struggles daily with stress and self-care. So these things that I'll be talking about are things that I am in the process of implementing myself, or have been implementing for a number of years, and they've been of benefit to me as I navigate difficult times and as things come along. So understand that all the examples that I give are not me speaking from any mountaintops. They're actually just me talking about my experience with some of these strategies, and I hope that the strategies are somewhat helpful for you. I do think outside of self-care, I know a lot of folks that we have on here also do work in the field of addiction, the field of education, and a variety of other fields in the helping professions and law enforcement and a variety of other entities. I do think that the information that we'll be talking about today has general applicability, in that it'll help you be more effective in supporting the folks that count on you to provide services as well. So I think they're beyond just self-care. This isn't just a selfish presentation in that way. There will be general applicability when it comes to helping folks within your professional ability, or within your professional responsibility, is that this just-in-time information versus just-in-case information. I'm the Associate Director of the Autism Training Center here at Marshall University. And one of the things, we have a Behavior Mental Health Technical Assistance Center. And one of the things that we talk a lot about is, in times of crisis like this one, people don't need just-in-case information. They need just-in-time information. So I think it's really important that the information I provide today isn't just interesting information, but actually immediately useful information. And I've worked really hard to try to make sure that we do that, to try to make sure that I offer that to you within the cultural context of right now, within the psychological context of right now. So the first place we can start when we start looking at how do we navigate difficult times and how do we do these kinds of things, is understanding that stress and traumatized brains function differently. Now, in order to understand that, we have to first answer the question of, if we know that stressed and traumatized brains function differently, then what does it mean for a stressed and traumatized brain to function normally? I know folks will say, like, what is normal? Obviously, there's a large variance in normal, but we do know that there is a baseline neurological condition or functioning or response that the brain has. But when we talk about stressed and traumatized brains function differently, it's important that we start here. So normally, what we would say about how the brain operates is the brain's a pattern-seeking device. Now, what does that mean? What that means is your brain's primary job is to keep you alive. So what it does is it tries to analyze the environment in a way that can help you be successful, which means to stay alive, to be successful in the world. So let me talk to you about this way. So the main way that it does that is pattern recognition. So like when you were a baby, you'd be sitting there and you would say, all right, there's A, and there's B, and there's C. And then later on you'd say, all right, there's A, there's B, and there's C. And then eventually what would start to happen is your brain would go, there's A, there's B, I know what comes next. And then it prepares you physically and emotionally for what comes next. It prepares you for what C is going to be intellectually and emotionally. So you're ready to understand what's going to happen next. So that's what the brain does. So it looks at these patterns and it starts putting patterns together, so then you can, quote unquote, predict the future. Because if you can predict the future, you can protect yourself from harm, and you can also perform at the highest level. So your brain, its primary job is to collect these patterns, put patterns into models, and then use those models to navigate the world. So let me give you an easy example, a simple example. Let's say you've got a toddler. If you have one now, or if you've had one, the toddler's sitting there eating their dinner, and they have their sippy cup, and they drop their sippy cup off the table, right? And you're a parent, so you come over and you pick the sippy cup up, you put it back on the table. And if they're a toddler worth their salt, they wait until you go back and sit down, and then they take their sippy cup and they drop it off the table again, and they wait for you to come back, right? You come back, you pick it up and put it back on the counter. What's the kid doing? They're pattern testing. That's all they're doing. They're trying to figure out A plus B equals C. What happens when I drop my cup? What is the outcome of this specific situation? And what happens is, as the child has those experiences, as they have enough, we'll call it trials, to use a behavioral term, as they have enough trials where the cup falls and the response is consistent, then they can start to relax. Why? Because that pattern's predictable. And predictable patterns make you feel safe. They make you feel safe because they can predict the future and you don't have to worry about them. So the child doesn't have to sit and be anxious, and we'll talk about anxiety in just a minute, doesn't have to sit and be anxious about their sippy cup, because if it falls, they have security and understanding what might happen. So that's why the brain is a pattern-seeking device. That's how the brain puts things. Now, it's very simple in the idea that starts from like a sippy cup, but then gets really complicated as we get older in developing what are called internal working models. So our internal working models are these collection of patterns that create these models. And then, but my way you might think about it is, it's like the knowledge of the field of play and the rules of the game. So what internal working models do is they give us a sense of the landscape and the rules. And what makes internal working models for humans really challenging is one of the main things that happens is, as you get older, the models become more complicated. And as you get older, the rules change. So what the rules of 1998 are different than the rules of 2020. So what humans have to do is adapt to the rules on the same field. So that's why for humans, it's really complicated for us. And that's why we have such complicated neurology, is because we have to be so adaptable in society and in the situation. And actually, one of the things that's a struggle for folks is if you struggle with flexibility and adaptability, it manifests in challenges and the ability to navigate the world. So that's one of those things that we look at. So the brain's a pattern-seeking device. The patterns that we identify then build up into internal working models, and the internal working models help us to be successful and stay alive in the world. But this is where anxiety comes in. So what is anxiety? So anxiety, and this is obviously the term anxiety is a very is a mental health term. So it has lots of meanings and lots of research, and there's lots of debate on things. But I'll summarize it. In fact, that anxiety is fear of the unknown. So it's fear of the what if. So let's go back to the sippy cup example. If I go back to the sippy cup example, and the kid has the sippy cup, and they drop it off the counter, right? And the adult comes over, picks it up, puts it back on the table, okay? And then a little bit later, they drop the sippy cup again. But instead of coming back and picking up the sippy cup and putting it back on the table, the adult, let's say this adult is dysregulated, the adult comes over, picks the sippy cup up, curses, throws the cup in the sink, and scares the child. Now we have anxiety. Why? We have anxiety because the pattern has been disrupted, because I do not have a pattern that is predictable. So I can't predict the future, so I don't feel safe. So anxiety can be introduced in that way. And a lot of times what anxiety does is it overwhelms us. A lot of times what anxiety does is it because the rules of the game or the patterns are not predictable. And when the patterns aren't predictable, it makes us very nervous, and it affects us in that way. Now, let's talk about that and what COVID has done. Why is COVID anxiety provoking? Because it's disrupted our patterns, because we can't predict the future, because there's lots of things outside of our control, and I'll talk about that more in just a second. But the idea of anxiety in relation to the pandemic is our anxiety is high because we can't predict the future, because we're uncertain about what's going to happen next, which naturally upsets our neurology. So that fear of the unknown is where that anxiety comes from. Now, two ways to think about anxiety that's important, or pattern disruption that's important, is there may be, especially those who work with young people and older people as well, but it's more obvious in younger people because they're closer to earlier life. Anxiety can come from a person who comes from an environment that is predictably unpredictable, to use to use words that don't interchange necessarily. But a child who comes from an environment where caregivers aren't consistent, where people are dysregulated, where there aren't consistent and predictable patterns and routines, that person, especially within the first 3 years of life, especially first 3 years of life, even more so in the first year of life, if they have those patterns or those inconsistent patterns, the lack of routine, dysregulated adults, it can have lifelong consequences for the structure and functioning of neurology in regard to such things as being hyper responsive, overactive amygdala, those kinds of things, which we don't need to go through all that. But so one part that can make someone have a high level of anxiety is coming from environments that weren't predictable and consistent. Another part where anxiety can come from is when the world violates your pattern. So let's say you came from an environment that was predictable and consistent, and then you go into an environment that you don't know a lot about. So now you have anxiety because you don't know about the pattern or the ability you don't know how to navigate this new unknown world. So that's something that you can think about in that specific way. So let's also let me unpack it this way. So what happens is, as you spend more and more time in anxiety, so we know the brain's a pattern-seeking device, we have these models, the disruption of our models make us anxious. The more time you spend being anxious, the more difficult it is on your neurology. So what that does is that introduces what we call regulatory fatigue, because your neurological load is so high. So think about this. If you're carrying, let's say metaphorically, if you're metaphorically carrying this heavy load of functioning for a long period of time, it's exhausting. So what happens is you get tired. So that's what regulatory fatigue is. So the idea of regulatory fatigue is your day or your neurology or your experience is so overwhelming that it actually makes you tired, neurologically speaking. I mentioned why that's the case with COVID is because it's disrupted our patterns and it's made the living a heavier lift, whether for a variety of reasons. Let me give you a few examples just to make that point more clear. So think about this. Going to the store. So I like going to the store. I don't mind to go to the store. I don't mind to shop. Our local grocery store is called Kroger. Okay, you guys may have Kroger where you're at. I have a specific way. Like I have an app on my phone that I use. It's called the To Do app, it's the To Do app is somewhere I keep track of the different things that I need to get at the store at any time. It's also something that I go to the store, I have a very specific pattern. I put them in a certain order. So I go to the store in a certain order. I know when I go to the store, the way I go, I know how to check out, I know how to use my rewards card, all that kind of stuff. So if you think about it, going to the store for me in a normal situation is pretty easy. So let's say on a 0 to 100 scale of neurological load, maybe going to the store only requires about a 30% effort on my part to go to the store. And why? Because I've got a lot of routines and the pattern's predictable and I feel a lot of control. So only 30% energy, which means while I'm at the store, I don't have to focus a whole lot. I don't have to worry a whole lot. I can just kind of almost autopilot it to a degree. And then when I leave the store, because I did the activity wasn't very demanding, I have a fair amount of energy left over because the store didn't require that much of me. Now let's think about going to the store. It's different. My patterns have been disrupted, which makes me anxious. So how have my patterns been disrupted? Well, now I have to wear a mask. And now I have to worry about sanitation. And now I have to worry about social distancing. And now I have to worry about standing on the stickers so I'm far enough away from folks when I'm checking out. And what am I touching? And how many people have touched it before? So you hear all these things. Now, I'm not saying we shouldn't be doing these things. I'm saying, but we need to understand that in doing these things, it increases our neurological load, which is harder on us. There's nothing we can do about it, plus or minus, but it is harder on us from a functioning standpoint. So what was a 30% activity, maybe now is a 60% activity. So what that means is now when I'm at the store, I'm more preoccupied with the store. I can't go on autopilot because I have more to keep track of, more things that make me anxious. And then when I leave the store, I have less neurological energy. Why? Because the store now requires more from me, so I leave with less. So what we have to understand when we're taking care of ourselves, especially right now, is everything that is harder takes more from us, which that energy that's been taken from me, I only have 100% energy. And, I don't have like my store energy and my dad energy and my work energy. It's all 100%.